Salutations, respected viewers. Here I am on Trafalgar Square, and behind me you can see an equestrian statue of George IV. So I thought I should tell you about George IV, why he's so honoured. He was the son of King George III. George III became king in 1760, and very shortly afterwards he married Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, because Germany was divided into 360 states at the time. She was from one of those. Some of the German states were independent, some semi-independent, others not, like part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, soon they were blessed with a bonny baby boy who was George IV. Anyway, his parents had a very, very happy marriage. So happy, in fact, that they had 16 children. And George III, uniquely for English monarchs, was faithful to his good wife. Anyway, so George IV, he was brought up by private tutors. Well, first of all, he actually wasn't with his parents a lot of the time. He was whisked away to grow up in another palace just a couple of weeks after he was born, because there was too much of a chance that he would contract a contagious disease, and that was common for royalty at the time. And the other thing is, his mother didn't breastfeed him. He had a wet nurse to breastfeed him, because for various reasons it would be beneath her dignity. She didn't want to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning because he was hungry. The other reason is obviously suckling an infant is contraception. It reduces a woman's fertility, makes it difficult to conceive, and that's why she was producing a baby a year for quite some time. So George IV, he had 8 brothers and 7 sisters. So a very, very big brood, and all of them lived to adulthood. George IV, George IV rather, he was soon invested as Prince of Wales. They didn't actually hold a ceremony in Wales to do so. So the family spent almost all their time in southeast England. Though when the American Revolution broke out, one of his younger brothers, the future William IV, went to the United States there as a part of the British Army. Obviously it wasn't the United States at the time. The UK didn't recognise it as the United States, not until 1783. So George III was very active, probably maybe even hypomanic and hyperactive, but George IV was rather different, was known for his lassitude, and his father was a very irascible character, was increasingly fed up with his brother, though it's not his brother, his son rather. So George IV showed little inclination to wed. And George III was eager for his sons to marry young, but not his daughters. He wouldn't let them marry until they were approaching 30, which in those days was well past it. It was like being left on the shelf. Anyway, so George IV, not particularly scholarly, very self-indulgent, loved gambling, playing the tables at cards, gambling on GGs, that's horses, and mixing with the demi-monde, going down to Brighton, where he had his pavilion built in an Indian style, and there was a small Indian community in the United Kingdom at the time. And then he took up with Maria Fitzherbert, this twice widowed Catholic woman, and because of the Royal Marriages Act, nobody could wed without the king's say-so. And George III discovered that one of his younger brothers had married without his permission, and George III was incensed, and that's why the Royal Marriages Act was passed, requiring the sovereign's permission to marry. Now, there's no way on earth that George III was going to allow his son and heir to marry a Catholic woman, and indeed no Catholic or anyone married to a Roman Catholic was permitted to ascend the throne. At the time, a lot of anti-Catholicism. So it's believed that George IV married Maria Fitzherbert in secret, and I think she had no children from either of her marriages, and she had no children with him. So he stayed with her for years, and she was a few years older than him as well, making her even more unsuitable. That was that. So he was hugely in debt. In 1788, his father was struck ill with porphyria, a mental illness, though there is some debate amongst medical historians as to what the real nature of his ailment was. And then the Reverend Dr. Willis took over his treatment. So Willis, he was an Anglican clergyman, but he was also a medical doctor from Lincolnshire, and he had George III come and work on his farm. He was not exempted from doing menial labour on account of his regal status. And after some months he recovered himself, because he'd been particularly volatile. He had this explosive temper which he hadn't had before, and he was babbling for hours, this verbal diarrhea, and going on about his pet subjects. Farmer George, they called him, because he was indeed fixated with farming. So he was physically, he was fit as a fiddle, always a very vigorous man, unlike George IV, who was given to portliness, well, obesity towards the end of his reign. Anyway, so that the Regency Act was passed, and therefore George IV became king in everything except for formal designation, having to exercise his father's kingly functions whilst his father was indisposed. But George III remained intermittently insane for the rest of his life, and his the periodicity of this mental illness changed. It wasn't always the same. His periods of mania became longer and more severe, and then his recoveries became briefer and less total. And by the 18 teens, he was blind, George III, and things like they tied him up and they kept him in the dark, and they put hot glass on his legs to try and draw the humours down from his brain, such was the medical thinking of the time. Because one of George III's equerries, as in an army officer who's kind of his flunky, his mother-in-law had been mentally ill, and she'd been successfully treated by Dr. Willis, because psychiatry was in its infancy, and we even often thought it was more of a spiritual thing. So on and off, George IV was exercising a regal power. Now, he was very fond of the Whig Party, not that he really had political ideas, but he liked Charles James Fox, and the Whigs thought they could use him because George III was a dyed-in-the-wool Tory, a reactionary, even by the standards of the time, who was unwilling to consider any concession to American demands, and was very against the French Revolution, the Jacobins, as in that's the most radical faction of the French Republicans. Whereas many people of moderate opinion in the United Kingdom welcomed the French Revolution initially, in 1789, thinking it wasn't actually that revolutionary to start with. The French didn't even abolish their monarchy, not for the first 3 years. But obviously things changed later. And there was the Catholic Relief Bill, and George III was dead against that. William IV was much more George IV was much more sympathetic than his father, partly because he was in love with Mrs. Fitzherbert. Anyway, so the Whigs were led by this time, the 1780s, or certainly from 1783 onwards, by Pitt the Younger. William Pitt, known as Pitt the Younger because his father, also William Pitt, was Pitt the Elder. His father, being ennobled as Earl of Chatham, was a Whig Prime Minister. Pitt the Younger, not formally a Tory, but widely regarded as being a Tory, his supporters usually called Pittites. And he was on the side of George III, so he did everything in his power to underreport George III's mental illness, to play it down, because he knew that he would get cooperation from George III. Now, it wasn't a dictatorship. The king's word was not law. We weren't ruled by royal fiat, but the king had very extensive powers of patronage to appoint people, to demote people in the army, in the Royal Navy, in the Church of England, the Church of Scotland, the Church of Ireland, give out peerages, make people judges. There are certain certain schools and universities he controlled, and on and on. So in politics, well, we know you have to hand out the baubles. A lot of it was about jobbery. Okay, jobs for the boys. Bob's your uncle, as they say. If you had friends in high places, you had the right relatives, you could get a sinecure. So that's why Pitt the Younger really wanted George III to be judged to be sane and capable of executing his regal duties, and not George IV the other way around. Eventually, George IV was prevailed upon to wed Caroline of Ansbach, another scion of a German noble house, in return for a hefty subvention from Parliament, because it was hugely in debt. He'd also built Carlton House, which is just down the street from Buckingham Palace. Incidentally, it's only in 1761, just after George III became king, the royal family purchased Buckingham House from the Duke of Buckingham, and that's why it's called Buckingham Palace, and turned into Buckingham Palace. And there's the yellow sandstone bit you can't see from the street. That's the 18th century part, and the modern grey Portland stone part is a sort of an early 20th century addition, reign of Edward III, completed about 1910. So they spent a lot of the time in Kensington Palace and Windsor Castle, in other places. So then George IV, he got his debts paid off, but he was still hugely in debt. His father was absolutely fed up with him, that he wasn't a decent soldier, he wasn't a sailor, he wasn't an academic type, he wasn't particularly religious, he was just a corpulent voluptuary, what else could I say, a hedonist, an Epicurean. So he was a pleasure seeker, known for his dissipation. So a bitter disappointment to his father, but he was keener on some of his younger sons, like Adolphus and Octavius. Anyway, so the next brother down, Duke of Albany and the Duke of York. He had both titles. He wasn't as bad in George III's estimation as his eldest son. Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, got along reasonably well with his father. Anyway, so Caroline Ansbach was delivered of one daughter who died after a few years, and George IV and his wife absolutely loathed each other. They made no secret of it. Anyway, so remember Leigh Hunt, the famous writer, penned an article about 1805 celebrating the 50th birthday of George IV, saying in his half century of life he's done nothing for which we should be grateful. Anyway, that was judged to be criminal libel, lèse-majesté, and Leigh Hunt got 2 years in prison for that. So freedom of expression was severely limited due to Sedition Act. Sedition was very broadly interpreted to do anything liable to cause disaffection to His Britannic Majesty. They were still calling themselves Kings of France until 1799, certainly, and the Peace of Amiens, they agreed never to repeat that one. They didn't actually renounce it. So we all know 1820, George III finally died. People have grown fond of him. He'd been deeply unpopular to that time. The 1780s, when he'd appeared in public, at best had been greeted with deathly silence by the crowd, and often with whistles, boos, jeers, and catcalls. Anyway, then finally George IV came to the throne, and he immediately began divorce proceedings against Caroline of Ansbach. Didn't quite managed to have her locked up, and blah blah blah. Anyway, he was hugely overweight by that time, an unimpressive figure. He did go on a trip to Scotland, and no monarch had been to Scotland for a century. That was organised by Sir Walter Scott, the renowned novelist and poet. And so that really revived Tartan, and the monarchy became extraordinarily popular in North Britain, and they often called it North Britain in those days, not just Scotland. So finally in 1830 he breathed his last. He had no surviving children. He'd had a new mistress after Maria Fitzherbert. So this younger woman had replaced Maria in the king's affections. So that was that, and the crown did solely and lawfully, rightfully pass to his eldest surviving brother, William of that name IV, the Sailor King, Sailor Billy. Well, I shan't tell you too much about Sailor Billy. Well, Sailor Billy, unlike his elder brother, had 10 children. The only problem is none of those children were with his wife. They were with Mrs. Jordan, an Irish actress. Okay, so that's enough about George IV, the Prince Regent as he's known. From 1788 onwards to 1820 is known as the Regency, that period, when he ruled as a regent on and off.